Okay, so here we are again, everybody. Thanks. In this lecture, we'll be learning about some basics of economic models. So if you're watching this and you don't have copies of these slides, please feel free to write me and I'll be happy to send you the slides that go along with this course. Okay, so we're going to think about why we might want to model economic activity. Okay, sort of the parts that would go into that. Now, the thing about economic models is they're models, right? They're not designed to be realistic. They're designed to illustrate specific aspects of reality that we wish to better understand. So, for example, if I had a small model plastic car or something like that, the car obviously doesn't go on its own. It's not going to take me to the grocery store. But if I wish to convey the idea of a car and what it sort of looks like and what its essential elements are to somebody, right, to anybody, then the model car would suffice. I could explain that it has four wheels, that it has an interior space for people to sit in, it has steering and an engine of sorts to drive the vehicle and make it go. Right? It has all the essential elements of car, right? Even though it doesn't perform the actual main function of car, getting me somewhere, right? Okay, this is a model, right? So don't expect that the model that we're going to build today is realistic. It is not. That is not its function. Its function is to help us understand how various parts of the economy relate to each other. So let's start by sort of brainstorming about what we think household spending might look like. Okay, so we see some of that over here, right? Okay, so let's say that we assume that households earn some kind of income. So we hypothesize that households earn some kind of income. So that income comes into my household, and let's call that amount a letter Y. And then let's say that what I can do with that income, well, I can spend it, I can not spend it, and I can pay my taxes. And so let's say that in the sum of those three choices, so the amount I choose to spend, the amount I choose not to spend, and the amount that I'm required to pay in taxes, make up the entirety of my income. Then we can create the formal expression that Y, my income, is going to be equal to the sum of C, or my consumption spending, spending I choose to do, plus S, savings, spending I choose not to do, plus T, my tax obligation. In this way, we have an expression that shows that my income is equal to the total of my various types of expenditure decisions. Spend, don't spend, pay taxes. Now, we're not saying anything about what those amounts are at this point. We're just beginning to construct a model. By doing what? By just thinking about what my personal economy looks like. When the rest of the world gives me something and what I put back in terms of the rest of the economy. Okay, so let's keep going then. Let's say that, well, I think that I'm going to spend money no matter whether I have income or not. I've got to pay the mortgage on the house. I've got to pay the car payment. I've got insurance payments I need to make, so that even if I lose my job, okay, I still have those payments to make. Okay. Let's also say that there are some expenditures, some consumption spending that I choose to do, and that spending is related to my income. So if I get a raise, I'm going to spend a little more. If my pay gets cut, I'm going to spend a little less. And let's finally say that the amount that I'm going to spend a little more is maybe, so if I get a raise of maybe $100, let's say I'm going to spend a little less than $100. Greater than zero, but less than 100. And similarly, let's say if my pay gets cut by $100, I'm going to cut my spending too, but a little less than 100. Maybe I only cut it by 90 or 80. So let's say that is the relationship between my income and my spending. Okay. Now, the first part of that spending, the spending that we do regardless of income, economists have a fancy word for that. They call it autonomous spending. And they also have a fancy word for the other type of spending that we do, call it induced spending. So spending that is related to income. Okay. So what would this model look like? Oh, and finally, let's say that, well, I'm going to pay my taxes regardless. So, whatever tax obligation I have, I need to pay it. Well, so let's summarize. I'm going to spend some money no matter what. If you give me more income, I'm going to spend a little more. If you cut my income, I'm going to spend a little bit less, and I'm going to pay my taxes. That's a pretty straightforward hypothesis, right? Okay. Well, there's a formal expression that says exactly that. Mathematically, y equals C0 plus C1 times the quantity y minus t, where C0 is autonomous spending, C1 times y is induced spending, making C1 particularly what? C1 is the relationship between changes in income and how my spending changes. So for example, every time I get another dollar in income, if I spend 90 cents of it, then C1 is 0.9. Okay. So the story here says, I spend money. If you give me more money, I'm going to spend more of it, but save some of it too. And then I'm also going to pay my taxes. Okay. I think that's a pretty straightforward explanation of household spending. And if you're thinking like, geez, it seems so straightforward, how can it ever explain anything? I think you're going to find that simple explanation is going to get us to understanding about 90% of what macroeconomists say about the economy. If you're thinking like, wow, that's great. Okay, good. That's what we're here to do, right? Okay. All right. So here's explanation of what I just said, right? So here's the explanation of all the variables. You want to pause it and write these down. That would be great. Make sure you get it. I think that's probably enough. Okay. So here's what I was saying a moment ago. Our model says so far, people spend money, and if they get some more money, they spend some of that after they pay their taxes. Okay. Pretty clear, I hope. All right, let's keep going and see where it gets us. Okay, you'll note some things about this. First, all incomes become expenditures, and that's always true. My income is somebody else's spending. My spending is somebody else's income. When I went to the store and bought this seltzer water, that's expenditure for me, but this expenditure becomes somebody else's income. So when we look at expenditures in the aggregate and incomes in the aggregate, they're going to be equal to each other. And indeed, when we look at the data, GDP incomes, GDP expenditures technically don't line up to each other because everything doesn't get reported properly. If everything got reported properly, it'd be the same. Okay. All right. Now, you'll note some other things about our model. The model, as it says right now, is that any desired savings, so anything we don't spend by households, right? So any money savings, any money saved is going to lead to a decline in future incomes. Okay, you may not see that yet, but you'll see it in a few minutes. You'll also note that taxes are going to reduce from future income too. Basically, anything that I receive as income that I don't spend back to business, right? So let's say I was paid $100 at my job. That means at the workplace, there's $100 worth of value that I created. Well, if they only sell $80 worth of value, because I paid $10 in taxes and saved the other $10, well, that's a problem for the business, right? Because their costs, 100, are greater than their revenues, 80. Okay, talk about that more in a second. Okay, so what's being implied by our little macro model is that any savings by me or taxes paid by me have to some way, shape, or form be returned to the economy, or the other end, somewhere else in the economy, they're going to have a deficiency in spending exactly equal to, or excuse me, a deficiency in revenues exactly equal to the deficiency in my spending. Okay. Okay, so, obviously people save, right? And obviously people pay taxes. And obviously the economy doesn't completely collapse every time people do this. So there must be something missing with our model. Okay. Well, when we save money, of course that we're generally paid interest if we save it in the bank, right? And of course the bank doesn't, in normal times, just sit on that cash. They lend that cash back out to somebody else. Well, that borrowing of that liquidity from others is referred to by economists as investment spending when it's done by businesses. So when a business builds a new factory and they borrow money to do that, when a business brings in new software for its employees and they borrow to do that, this is called investment spending. Indeed, inventory and process, another idea that we've discussed earlier and we'll discuss in the future, inventory and process at a business is also considered investment expenditure by business. Okay. Similarly, of course, the government spends too. Hard to imagine, but indeed it's true. Right? And so let's introduce those additional ideas of expenditure into our little model. So we've got this household spend model, and now businesses and government too. Well, now we've got something that looks like this, right over there. So it's incomes are equal to, incomes are equal to the spending that I do automatically, the spending that I do after I get paid, the taxes that I pay, plus the spending that businesses do, plus the spending that the government does. Okay, all right, so that's good. Okay, so, is this essentially correct? Well, yes, in any economy, if one part of the economy has a surplus of nominal resources, right, then some other economy must have a nominal deficit, must have borrowing or debt. In a similar fashion, if some segment of the economy has a real deficit, that is, they've got, that I built stuff, but yet I didn't use the stuff, that's a real deficit, then some other segment of the economy must have a real surplus. That is to say, they've built stuff that they didn't yet sell. Okay, so put these ideas together for a second. This is what our model's already telling us. My savings, right, is a money representation of the difference between the value that I created at work versus what I actually consumed in terms of real output, stuff. Okay, well, where is that stuff? That stuff is with a business. The business has the reverse position. The business has more stuff produced than sold. We call that inventory. Okay, they also operate with a negative financial position, that at this moment in time their revenues are less than their costs, equal to what? Equal to my savings, assuming that the government position is neutral. That is to say, government taxes equals government spending. So my nominal surplus is business's nominal deficit. My real deficit is business's real surplus. It's the same thing. Okay, so our model already shows us that. Okay, so let's try plugging some numbers into this, right? So let's throw some numbers at it and see this works. I'm just going to kind of pull these numbers out of the air here right now. Let's assume that households earn $1,000 per time period. And let's further assume that they have $250 in required spending or autonomous spending. So that's like your rent, right? This mortgage, things like that I said. And they have an additional $400 in desired spending. So that's the induced spending. Say they have a tax bill of $200. And of course, if we add those three up, that means they have $150 in savings. They're saving 50%. They're spending 65%. And they're paying taxes at 20%. Okay. 65 plus 20 plus 15, 100%. So using our little model then, plugging in those numbers, C is going to equal, or total consumption spending by households is going to equal 250 plus 0.5 times 1,000 minus 200. Okay. If you're thinking like, oh yeah, right? No, stop this video, get out a piece of paper, work through it yourself. Okay. Make sure you understand it before you go any further. All right. Welcome back. Okay, so the last thing here is this 0.5. What is a 0.5? Well, the 0.5 is just telling you that after people take care of their required obligations, they desire to spend 1/2 of that discretionary income. Okay, now how did we know that? Well, we can derive that by plugging in all the other given values and solving out to find out what's left. and that's 0.5 in this case. Now, if it's not super clear, again, pause the video, work it out yourself, and then it will be very clear. Okay, let's continue. Okay, if we solve that out, we get 650, and then we notice that the difference between household incomes, which were 1,000, and household spending, 650, is the sum of desired savings and the tax bill. Okay, now economists call that idea, that difference, a leakage. Why a leakage? Well, because it's revenue that's coming into households but isn't returning automatically to the economy. It's being leaked out of the economy, if you will. Okay? So it is the amount of income that we need some alternative source besides households to make up, to balance the economy. Okay? As I mentioned, these leakages are a source of potential problem, right? For the reasons I just mentioned. Because if that additional $350 doesn't return somehow to the economy, then businesses are in a deficit position where their costs, 1,000 that they paid me, are less than the revenues they receive from me, 650. Okay. So if that isn't made up somehow, right, that business is going to collapse. Okay, so what needs to happen is that those leakages need to return back to businesses in some way, shape, or form. So let's go back to our little model. In our little model, we said that government spends. Okay, well, where does government spend to? We always hear about government spending. We think like, oh, government's wasting that or whatever. Well, where does government spending go? Most government spending goes to businesses, right? So you're thinking like, whoa, wait a second. Okay, well, take a look outside your window. Turn off the news, take a look outside your window. Who built the road? When the road came in and through your house, was it government contractor X that built it? No, it was some local construction company that built the road. But who paid for it? Government. The school that your kids go to. Government, paid for by government. Okay. The police, the fire department, the army, the military, the guards, country. They're all paid for by government. Okay. And they all utilize private services and private businesses. Okay. So if we consider government expenditures an additional source of business revenue, right now, because now we started with 650 from households, now we're up to 850. All right. Well, what if the business also agrees to hold $150 in inventory for future sales, right? Well, then we're in the clear, right? So if we say that that inventory in process represents, maybe the business takes out a line of credit from the bank to, maintain that stock of inventory or some other expenditures they might have, well, now we're all good. That last expenditure, that's business investment spending. Okay. So if we line all those numbers up, we get this. We get what we see right here. Household income, $1,000. Consumption spending, $650. Tax bill, savings, nominal surplus, real deficit. Okay. The last thing I have here is sidewalk. I'll come to that in a minute. Okay. Government received $200 in taxes, spent $200, is neutral, right? Maybe it has a real surplus. Let's say they took that $200 from my taxes and they built a sidewalk. Well, who owns the sidewalk? Do I own the sidewalk as a citizen, or does the government somehow? Okay, whatever, right? So that's why that last entry there. Businesses, business revenue is 850, right? 650 from me, 200 from the government. Business expenses were 1,000. They paid me. They have a nominal deficit of 150, real surplus of 150 that we call inventory in process or business investment spending. So Y, incomes on the far left-hand side, equals big C, which is 650, big I, investment spending, which in this case is 150, big G, which in this case is 200, 1,000 total model. Okay. So is the system stable? Yes, as long as the business is willing to keep the 150 in inventory and government keeps spending the taxes it receives. Okay. Okay. Hypothetical here. What if businesses don't want to keep that inventory? Maybe if they're panicked, right? They're like, oh my gosh, we got to get rid of all this stuff. The economy is going to take a downturn. So they only want to keep 50 inventory. Okay, run all the numbers through, and you know what you find? Is that spending is insufficient in total to maintain my current level of income. So the business is going to, excuse me, the economy is going to start contracting. We're going to start entering a recessionary phase of the economy. Will it ever stabilize out? The answer is yes. At that level of desired inventories, the economy will stabilize out at incomes equal 800 rather than 1,000. In other words, we're going to see a 20% decline in total economic activity, or a 20% decline in GDP under that scenario. Now, we can also change things like household spending, right? So like, what if households choose to spend a little differently, or how they adjust to income? Well, we can work that through the model, right? And see how that plays out too. If households decide they just want to spend a little less, then the economy also contracts because total expenditures is insufficient to maintain existing levels of income. So business activity starts contracting. Hire less people, pay them less, so on and so forth. Until when? Until expenditures stabilize out again with incomes. Okay, so what I encourage you to do is, with the class, I actually have this little model, right? So this whole thing that we just were doing with all the numbers, I've programmed into an Excel spreadsheet and made available to you, so you can download that spreadsheet and you can change any of the variables you want and see how it restabilizes out. Okay, you want to change autonomous spending, sort of like what happens if everybody's mortgage payment goes up, right? Okay, plug it in, change autonomous spending, raise it up. Or like, what happens if cost of living goes up? Again, change autonomous spending. What happens if business, wants to stack up huge inventories? Okay, change it, right? And watch what happens. And that little model is going to help you understand a good chunk of sort of how the economy and how what we call fiscal policy, that is government spending and taxation policy, works. And it's also going to tell you the relationship of various business activities and business projections of the economy on things like aggregate income. So if business thinks the economy looks bad in the future, they're going to try to start dumping inventories. They're going to drop their level of desired investment, and that's going to hammer household incomes. And you can enter a recessionary phase. If the future looks really good for business and they're willing to produce a whole bunch of stuff even when sales aren't so hot, that's going to boost up household incomes. And you can see all that right with this little model. So again, it hits most of what you're going to hear on the news, right? And all from what? All from a simple assumption that people spend money, and if you give them more, they spend more. That's all we did. All right, thanks everybody. We'll leave it there. See you next time. Take care.